and welcome to the Business of Data podcast. I'm your host, Catherine King, and it's a pleasure to have you join us today. In this series, we'll be speaking to senior data analytics leaders to share their experiences, challenges, and insights. Let's go ahead and dive straight into today's episode. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Business of Data podcast. This week, we will be focusing our theme all around AI, specifically looking into ethical, responsible, and explainable AI. We couldn't think of anyone better than to bring in Scott Zoldi, who is the CAO from FICO. As the Chief Analytics Officer for FICO, Scott Zoldi is actively involved in the development of new analytics products and big data applications. Whilst at FICO, he has been responsible for authoring 110 patents for analytics technology, with 56 granted and 54 pending. Scott received his PhD in theoretical and computational physics from Duke University and focused much of his postdoctorate work on the study of chaos theory. He lives and works near FICO's headquarters in San Diego, California, and he also serves on the board of numerous industry groups in the area. Wow, what an introduction. Welcome, Scott.
Thank you.
How are you doing
Pleasure
today?
To be here. I'm great, thank you.
Awesome. Well, it's absolutely lovely to have you. And I'm going to dive in straight away with some questions. And I always like to get in a nosy question first. And I see on your LinkedIn, it says that you've always loved San Diego, California, since you visited as a postdoc student. Now, I've never been myself. It was definitely on the bucket list. So what drew you to that place originally?
I really enjoyed San Diego for a couple of reasons. One is just it's a beautiful place, right? So the beaches, the weather, and people are pretty laid back, and it was very different than other parts of the United States that I had been living. So when I visited a friend here, I decided this was a really great place to be. And, it's interesting how life takes you on different journeys, because I went and researched leading AI companies. And while on that same visit, I found there was a company called HNC Software. And so it was kind of like two things hitting at once. And HNC is where I got my start. And so that was one of the reasons I've moved to San Diego, but I enjoy it thoroughly.
Oh, wow. So really the stars aligned for you, and that's kind of how you found yourself there. That's fantastic. So I mentioned in the intro that you have authored a number of patents for AI technologies across your career. And I'm going to start this podcast with a really, really difficult question, because I'm going to ask you, out of all of the ones that you have patented, what is the one you're most proud of?
Yeah, I mean, that's really tough, right? So if I think through it, right, I think one of the ones I'm most interested in and kind of most excited about was one which is called multi-layered self-calibrating analytics. And the reason why I like this one is it's a very early patent around AI that is self-learning, right? It's essentially AI that works without data, that explores what we call the latent features or the relationships that are within that data set. For problems that you can't solve that depend on data. And so we leverage that technology usually in the areas of cybersecurity or brand new fraud scenarios where there's no historical data. And so really nice technology that kind of essentially automatically learns the different nonlinearities and then works with a human being. So it's really this sort of concept of AI and human beings working together to solve a problem. So that's probably the one that I didn't, would be my favorite.
Fantastic. I know it's always hard to pick a favorite when you're probably proud of quite a lot of them. So let's get into the meat of this topic, and just for the benefit of the audience to allow you guys some context, FICO recently commissioned Crinium to conduct an in-depth survey of 100 C-suite executives, mostly chief data officers, chief analytic officers, and chief analytics and data officers combined. And this was all aimed at discovering how they're working on building AI-powered organizations in today's very disrupted business environment. So really, Scott, let's start out this conversation by working through what was the idea behind this research? Kind of where did that spark come from for you?
So for us, we really wanted a benchmark of the industry and where, people were with respect to AI. We see a lot of people very interested in what AI can offer and machine learning can offer in terms of business benefits. But there's a wide variety of maturity that we see
Hmm.
in the field. And so we wanted to really get a benchmark of that and a better understanding of where the industry was. And who better than the CAOs and CDOs to kind of give that
Yeah.
perspective. And because they can give a very honest sort of internal view of their own sort of progress with advancing these technologies. And for us as a leading AI machine learning company, it was really important to make a determination for where everyone is on this journey,
Hmm.
particularly nowadays as AI and machine learning is getting out of the sort of infancy stages of business adoption and getting into the maturity stage.
Absolutely. And obviously, ourselves as event directors, I mean, you look at the agendas from, say, 5 years ago to now, what was starting out as just kind of beginning that journey. And you hit the nail on the head perfectly by saying kind of moving beyond that infancy. And I think having a report and a study to work out now where people are out of the gate is a fantastic idea. Now, obviously, you are well ingrained in this community. So when you were kind of thinking about this project, with your own professional experience and kind of knowledge of others, what were your kind of expectations of where this research would go?
So one of the expectations that I had was that we would see some sensibility across the
Okay.
CAOs and CDOs, and one of the reasons for that is, we are being bombarded almost continuously with brand new cloud technologies
Hmm.
and technologies that will auto build models. And I think one of the things that I expected to see and I was glad to see is things like scorecards and regression still continue to be key technology um, for the CDOs and CAOs, because they are really well suited for regulatory environments. They're very well understood and very seasoned technologies. And so I was pleased to see that that we weren't overtaken by the hype of deep learning or the access to cloud technology.
Yeah.
So I think that was interesting. We also had a really strong interest on what was the pandemic response to the use of AI. We
Hmm.
know where it was before, but with the pandemic, there's lots of interesting challenges. The data is changing very rapidly. People are questioning whether they can use the existing technologies, whether they would go and use AI to learn quickly, on non-transient data. And so that was also something we wanted to have an understanding. And then I think finally, the piece that I was excited to see was that everyone's focused on ethical AI and explainable AI, which are
Hmm.
tremendously important concepts. And we see that even the largest organizations in the world making very significant mistakes for the uses of machine learning technology around those concepts. And it was good to see that nearly everyone that's been kind of surveyed had a view that was important, and that's what I
Yeah.
expected, and I was very happy to see that. Otherwise, I'd be much more concerned about the AI machine learning that is used to make decisions around us as consumers and us as individuals and society.
Absolutely. So let me pick up on that point, just for the benefit of the audience and for me myself. Can you explain perhaps the terms and then the differences between explainable AI, ethical AI, and then responsible AI? Because often they do get clustered together, but they are kind of separate terms in themselves, aren't they?
Yeah, so explainable AI would be the first one, which is a technology that allows us to go and give the reasons why the machine learning model provided let's say
Hmm.
a score or an outcome. And those are really important because it allows us as human beings an understanding of how did the machine make a determination, or what would be an explanation that we would give, Catherine, in respect to
Yeah.
a decision that was got made. It's been around for a very long time, more than 20 years. But there's lots of different technology out there. I think our biggest challenge is probably lack of standards. Then there's ethical AI, and ethical AI has always been important, and it's even more important if you look at today's events with respect to being ethical, and it applies to models as well. And I think if we look at our own social context today, when we build models, they're built on data that reflects our society, and to the extent that the data that is around our society is biased, which it is, then you need to build models that you can demonstrate do not necessarily reflect the same biases within society. And so it's a set of technology and approaches that basically look at models and look at different protected classes, whether it be different ethnicities, whether it be different protected groups, and say, is the model being more biased or harsher towards one group of individuals than another, and then making a determination of how to remedy that.
Mm-hmm.
And then finally, responsible AI is essentially demonstrating that you've done the explaining, you've done the ethical AI sort of analysis, you can prove it, you can demonstrate it to regulators, but you've also built the model in a responsible way, meaning that there are safeguards on this model, much like, every time you step in a car, the brake pedal is not in a different part of the car, right? And so,
Yeah.
there are certain standards that we have for, when we drive an automobile, where we expect the pedals to be. The same thing applies to AI. We have to show that it was built safely, it was built responsibly, that we chose the right sort of data, and we have protections to alert people when they may not want to use this model and go to an alternate technology. And that would be responsible AI, which groups all those concepts together.
Fantastic, brilliant. Now I'm going to look at my notes for this next question I want to ask you, because I want to get the numbers right. So in the study that we did together, it showed that 93% of those who responded, so the CDOs, CAOs, say that ethical considerations represent a barrier to AI adoption in their organizations. I mean, that's such a big number, 93% answering that. Were you surprised by that number when you saw it?
Not really. I mean, I think I think we're starting to get an understanding of the fact that the hype cycle of AI is over and the hard work has begun, and I often talk about it's time for AI to grow up. And so from that perspective, I think many people are looking at their organizations and understanding that they have to define one standard within the organization. They need to make sure that it aligns from a regulatory perspective. They need to align all the data scientists around a centralized management or standardization of how you do that. And that takes a lot of work, right? And so I interpret that as, it's a barrier because it has to be done. And probably there's some framework that most organizations need to do to set those up properly. And get buy-in from legal and buy-in from their C-suite with respect to how that's done. And that takes work, right? Versus if you could just, put out a model and not necessarily go through all that rigor, then, that's relatively straightforward. But in today's day and age with things like GDPR and all the different privacy and kind of AI regulatory legislation and guidelines out there, that time is over, right? And now there's some serious work and process in place for them to put in the right standards around ethical AI within their organizations.
Absolutely, I love that idea that the hype cycle's finished and the hard work begins. What a great soundbite that is. And then talking about that, then hard work, 96% of the survey respondents said that they put in some level of ethical standard and process in place, but out of that 96, only 33% said that they monitor their models to ensure that there's kind of a continued accuracy. So you had a large portion saying they've done that, but then the continuation on it was somewhat limited. So do you think what people are currently doing, and I think I can guess your answer, is enough? Is it sufficient in terms of what's being done to ensure this ethical work is being achieved?
So I think this is a reflection of the journey. And so I think, most people have this vantage point that we build a model, and when we build the model, we do the very best job we can. And if we've put in the testing around that at the time we built the model, and if we believe we're building models ethically, then, that probably explains the 96% figure. But I think what the challenge is, and this might be some of the barrier of the previous, point that we talked about, is to ensure that a model is ethical and working properly, you need to monitor it continuously, and not just for model performance, right? You need to look at it from an ethics perspective. So look at the pandemic, right? The pandemic, depending where you are in the world, affects different protected groups and ethnic groups differently based on their exposure to the virus and the types of work that they're forced to do. And that means that models that may have been ethical at the time they got built are no longer ethical today. And so I think that's the part of the journey that needs to continue, right? I did a talk recently where I represented this as as a car with a roof rack where you're bringing in a shovel and gasoline and you're going on some sort of safari, right? And so a model isn't just building the car and then releasing it from the showroom. It's coming with an owner's manual, and it's coming with all the tools you need to understand how it reacts to different conditions. And I think that's part of the growing up, right? To really see this as,
Yeah.
you're not done building the model when you've done building the model. You're done with the model when it ceases to be used, right? And so that means you're on the hook, and you're on the entire life cycle of the use of that
Yeah.
AI or machine learning within the organization.
I love that. So it's not a quick fix that I think was possibly, again, talking about the stages and journey that was previously said, the kind of the buzzwords of machine learning and AI and kind of the great things they could provide is kind of subsiding, and actually that understanding of it being a journey and an organic process is certainly there. So just to kind of wrap up this kind of theme then, in your view, what should executives be doing to ensure that their organizations are using AI technologies ethically? What kind of benchmarking things do you think should be there?
So I think one of the things that needs to be done is that, there has to be recognition that this is really a C-level or a board sort of responsibility to ensure that the models that are being built, have a standard established, right? That the standard may not be perfect, but it has to be a standard, it has to be written down, and there has to be governance around it. And so I think that's the very first step. And then there has to be some sort of organization, and typically, owned by and managed by the CAO or the CDO, to enforce that across the organization, right? Today, I've talked to organizations that don't have any, set process in place. I've talked to some that do have a process in place. I think that's the very first step. And once you have that step, then you can put governance around it to demonstrate that it's being used, to improve it over time, to socialize it with your peers, to go and have that discussion with the regulatory bodies with respect to what this looks like, to get to a point of parity, right? The standards and ethics of how this gets done, and ensure it's done properly. Without that, right, what you're going to have is hundreds of data scientists all trying their best to figure out what that means, and it's going to be 101 different ways of doing that, and that's not a process, and no organization would really stomach that, right? If we look at the parallel of software engineering, right? Most firms don't have dozens or hundreds of software development paradigms and repositories and what have you, and the same sort of rigor has to apply here.
Absolutely. Now, I want to ask you about transparency, because we kind of touched on it earlier where you were saying, kind of having that knowledge of what's going into the model and then kind of revising that. And you used that fantastic example with minority groups in COVID, and how, previously that data may have been okay, but now, the model may not be responding to it clearly. So do you think that AI leaders have a responsibility to ensure that these systems are operating in a fair and transparent way? And then the kind of second part to that is, do you think that AI systems should always be transparent and explainable?
So I think it's the responsibility of the CAO or CDO to ensure that the models that are built are to a standard of ethics and responsibility that they establish. And so it's the buck stops with them, right? And they should be empowered to enforce that across the organizations, right? Because at the end of the day, they're setting the highest level of standard for that organization. I also believe models should always be built transparently and ethically. And the reason for that is if you don't have a very strong understanding of what the model has learned, then you really don't understand how it may be responding to changing or different data. When we build models, we take data from a historical data perspective. We build a model and we assume that data will look exactly like the data from the previous history. And it won't. And then we say, well, we build these models to generalize or be robust. But in the end of the day, right, as we turn more and more of our decision making over to the machine, it's learning relationships that most human beings just don't have the ability to understand or to anticipate. And without that sort of visibility, right, you're really taking a risk. And some organizations will be burned very badly because they don't understand how the model will react to unseen or changing data. And that's why, when we do our work, right, we enforce that we need to understand each and every latent feature, which are these nonlinear nonlinearities in these models, so we can examine them. Are they palatable? Are they monotonic? Do they make sense?
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
that sets the guide rails for where we may not want to use the model in the future. So I believe every model should be built that way, and there shouldn't be a decision process that would say yes, this model should and this model should not.
Absolutely. So I want to pick up on a point you said there. So you said that the buck stops with the C-suite, whether that be CDO or CAO. But the challenging part about AI when you're starting to automate processes is kind of understanding who is accountable for the way that these AI systems operate. So do you still think that, even when these things become automated, that the buck still does remain with the CDO?
So I believe so, right? And that requires tooling, right? And so one of the things that we've been advocating for some period of time now is what we call a model governance blockchain.
Okay.
And so that model governance blockchain would basically establish and automate the process. So
Mm-hmm.
on that would be, what is the model I'm building? What is the data I'm using? Who signed off that the data is appropriate? What are the variables have been used? Have they been approved by the manager? Have they gone through a governance process? Which tests have been done, and so forth and so forth, with respect to explainable AI, the ethics testing, bias testing, and stability and robustness. And so I think if you have that process in place, and it would be named people, right? It would be
Yeah.
Sally did this and John did that, right? And they approved it or did not approve it. It puts a lot of more of accountability into the
Mm.
process, right? And so I think it would still end there, right? They would enforce that process, and again, like any other process, it would improve over time. But just simply having that and then automating it and auditing it, right? And that's why we want it on the blockchain, because you can't change history, right? If Scott's made some bad decisions, then Scott should be held to those
Yeah.
bad decisions. You should review them and improve upon them. So I think that's why it's so important to have something like this model governance blockchain, because then it allows the organization to have the one standard, to enforce that standard, and then understand where it's not being followed, right? To
Where the broken
remediate it.
link is. Yeah.
Exactly. Yep.
Fantastic, awesome. So let's move on in our themes, and I'm going to dive back into the report in front of me because I want to get these numbers correct. So from our respondents and from the research, it shows that 12% of enterprises with C-level folks said that they had experienced, so 12% of them, said they had experienced an adversarial AI attack. And then 24% of those guys had also seen data poisoning as well. Now, although compared to the other numbers we've discussed previously, 12 and 24% sounds quite low, but I have a feeling you're going to tell me that this is probably something that AI leaders need to be concerned about.
Absolutely. So I think they need to be concerned about it. And I think realistically, I mean, those are the numbers they know about, right? I think there's a lot more that they're probably unaware that's occurred, right? And
Yeah.
and I say that only because one of the boards that I focus on is around cybersecurity, right? And it's amazing how easy it is for either insiders within an organization and/or people hacking into an organization to go and manipulate data, right? And so I think the numbers are probably realistically higher. And I think why it's so important is because, at the very beginning of this, we are building models generally on historical data. And if that data is tampered with and manipulated, then,
Yeah.
we may or may not be able to see into that, right? And so, yes, if we look and build the models ethically and properly, we can go look at whether or not it makes sense. And that's why we should understand very, very deeply the models, because we as human beings can say, no, it doesn't make sense that people who have last names of Zoldi, right, have the very best scores, right? That shouldn't be, something that the model would have learned, right?
Yeah.
But that is something that if you haven't gone and done all the work to look at what the model has actually learned, you won't know. And it's very, very subtle. A lot of my work is focused on adversarial AI and basically machine learning models attacking machine learning models, and it's a bit of an arms race with respect to these technologies. And so, I think it's a real threat. I think it's something that most CAOs and CDOs don't spend enough time thinking about. But it goes back to this sort of broader view, right? If a model that you build is going to impact millions of consumers, let's say, right? And make some of those decisions are very big decisions for people. Let's say whether or not they get a loan or not, right? Or whether or not
Yeah.
they're blocked for certain types of transactions. That's really important, right? To go look at the impact of data and really put more controls in
Hmm.
place.
So just picking up on that, you say that you have this feeling that the C-suite aren't really thinking about this as much. Why do you think that is? Why do you think people aren't, why isn't this top of the to-do list?
So I think there's a big challenge that we still have today around data provenance and data
Hmm.
governance, right? And it's a big focus, particularly for the CDOs, but even CAOs. Where did the data come from? What is the quality of that data? A few years ago, you'd find that there'd be 100 different places where certain, let's say, a customer details would be located, and very often different. And you try to figure out which one is the right one
Yeah.
for Scott. I think that's gotten a lot better, right? But I think the quality of the data is always been a problem. When you look at model built development, it's almost accepted that the data is almost always messy and
Yeah.
somewhat challenging to work with. I think what's lost is, yes, amongst all that noise, which is data, right, is an ability to manipulate that data, and I just think it's a lack of awareness that this is a real problem. Generally,
Mm.
we think about cybersecurity, and we think, okay, someone's going to hack into my organization and steal a database and sell the information on the black market or on the dark web.
Yeah.
But I think more sophisticated criminals are going to get in and try to manipulate data such that it prefers, let's say, an outcome for them. And where these outcomes are made by models, and where the models are
Yeah.
not necessarily being built responsibly, they could very easily succeed in biasing a model in such a way that they have a preferred outcome, whether to commit a crime or to get a better rate or better arbitrage.
Yeah.
And that's what we have to really protect against.
So it's almost more subtle. So I mean, I had a question to ask you, saying kind of what are the biggest risks associated with that? But is it a case that it is, it's not as obvious as just someone coming in and stealing a lot of data? It is that level of shifting outcomes to be. Are there any other risks that you think are kind of up there for not dealing with this and having adversarial AI attacks?
So I think, one is to, we need to do all the responsible AI to make sure that what the model's learned makes sense, right?
Hmm.
But the patterns can be very subtle, right? The example of, people with the last name Zoldi or last names that start with Z, right? This would be a situation where, you may not find that as you look at the model, right? It may not
Right.
be that subtle. And so that requires a lot of this testing and ongoing testing. And, we saw in one of the earlier questions that we discussed, around only 33% monitor in production. Very often, you're going to see the effect of this adversarial AI once the model's out there live, right?
Yeah.
And that's where we would have to have other types of models. So very often, what we have in addition to the core model is a model that would look for anomalies or outliers in terms of the way that the data is being presented to the model as a way to detect these adversarial attacks. I think it's really hard, right? I mean, it's kind of in some sense it's humorous, right? We all get very excited about facial recognition and things like this, but we don't realize that the detection rates and the error rates are not that great, right? It's
Yeah.
relatively easy to trick an AI, and so from that perspective, I think it's just an education process. Ensuring that the data is making sense, you build responsibly, and then doing some comparisons and building models that would look for abnormalities within the data as the model is deployed and alert to it. And so that someone can go look at it from a human perspective and say, now, the model shouldn't be biasing this way towards, these groups
Mm.
of people or this particular type of transaction. We think something's awry here, and it may go way back to the model, right? And at that point, right, we need to have backup technologies if the model has truly been kind of tampered with through a data poisoning attack or other sort
Yeah.
of scenario.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Fantastic. So looking back into this report, I want to ask you if you were surprised when you saw that 1 in 3 of these executives believe that their organization isn't fully prepared for stricter regulations around ethical AI. Should they be?
So I'm not surprised that there's a number of that are concerned with this, right? I think
Mm.
um, most of the CAOs and CDOs don't have sufficient processes in place for the harder regulation. And to be fair, a lot of these sort of regulation or guidance is open for interpretation, right?
Yeah.
And so it's the biggest challenges that we have are, you know, CDOs and CAOs need to come together to come up with a set of standards, right? So let's say I have a methodology that I believe is sufficient from a regulatory perspective. Well, maybe the regulator doesn't think so, right? Or maybe it works for regulator A, but not for regulator B or C, right? Or maybe it
Mm-hmm.
depends on who they send to talk to me from 1 week to the next. And so I think our biggest challenge probably in being prepared for this is actually having a set of standards that we're all going to operate from, right? There are probably at least 24 different explainable AI algorithms out there,
Mm.
some good, some bad, some ugly, right? And so from that perspective, what are the ones that are going to be used for each industry? What is the standards, right? And I think there's a long way to go, and we have to do that in coordination with the regulatory bodies. So I think that's a big part of it, right? Even if one is the internal standards, which we've talked about, that probably need to be
Yeah.
established and developed and refined. But then two is, what's going to be broadly accepted from a regulatory perspective, particularly where, a lot of them are written with, broad guidance, right? Of kind of like, it's like, these are
Yeah.
the morals of models, right? And that's very different than demonstrating that you've met a standard, right? Of conduct. And so I think it's a challenging situation to be a CAO and CDO right now with these changing environments. I think, they need to band together, right? And I see the banks,
Mm-hmm.
we do a lot of work with the financial institutions. I see banks doing this very often, right? Where they have challenges with, understanding how to come up with a singular sort of standard that they use with the regulators. I think the same thing has to occur for models, and things will get a little bit more, more easier to kind of deal with respect to being
Yeah.
prepared and feeling that you're prepared, right? Because you need to understand what that standard would be and have agreement. And I think the more that we see this community coming together to do that, I think we would be in a better position. There are, frankly, probably no one better to make those recommendations than the CAOs and CDOs
Mm-hmm.
in collaboration and coordination. And so I think that's what needs to happen so that people feel more prepared.
Absolutely. Now, across this conversation, we've almost felt a bit doom and gloom about some things, but I know there's probably great examples of companies that are doing ethical AI and everything else that we've spoken about today quite well. Is there anyone that springs to mind for you who is kind of doing this a lot better than others?
So I think one of the things that I always get a lot of inspiration from is the customers that use some of our products. So we have something called Falcon. Falcon is one of the world's first and one of the more successful AI machine learning technologies for
Mm-hmm.
fraud. At the very inception of this product, there was already explainable AI in there, where you'd get a score and you'd get these 3 reason codes. And so I can look across our client base, which is some 9,000 financial institutions, and when they have a conversation with the client, they've been doing this for years now. They do it based on these reason codes that come from the model that help them understand how they should form that conversation, help the consumer understand why the transaction has been declined or blocked. And I think this is, an example of an expectation, right? And the same thing
Yeah.
applies in the credit risk areas, right, of our business, where, you have a credit score, but then you have the adverse reasons or action codes associated with that, where you can go and say, okay, the score could be better if you did X, Y, and Z. These are the reasons. And I think, those are really where we have to look at those sort of examples, I think, to get inspiration for what it's going to look like as models get more broadly adopted. Very often, we are kind of losing track of the fact that when we make an automated decision with a model, we need to actually have a conversation with a human being at the other end, and
Yeah.
not a data scientist and not someone that understands data, but a regular person that may or may not understand the ramifications of all the things that they've done, the quality
Mm-hmm.
of the data, and what have you. And I think we're going to see more of this, right? But I get inspiration from those early examples, which already established, right, a standard of, if I'm going to trust the model, I need to explain the model, and if the model isn't making sense based on the reasons or the explainable AI, then I'm not going to use that model, right? That's not something I'm going to be prepared to use, and I think that's the standard that needs to be set.
Absolutely. And I know you mentioned you've got this Falcon technology, but how else is FICO working to really help the industry in being, meeting those rigorous standards and, being ethical and responsible with AI?
Yeah. So one is around, just conversations like these, frankly, right? To just kind of, challenge, challenge people to think a little bit more broadly about their business. Concepts like, ethical AI is a continuous journey, maybe new to some people, as we saw in the survey, right?
Mm-hmm.
The other aspect of this is to basically start the commentary around, what are good technologies for, let's say, explainable AI or ethical AI? What are not as good
Yeah.
technologies, right? And to start those debates. So, a lot of my time is spent having those discussions, typically with the C-suite, with our client base, so that they understand these concepts as they look at their business more broadly. I think the other thing that we focus on now is, we're taking more and more of these technologies and making them available to clients or to data scientists that want to use tools from FICO. So, one of the things that I really have a lot of excitement around is taking the best practices and IP, and saying, well, this is the approach that we leverage, right?
Mm-hmm.
And making that available to data scientists. So, for example, we have our own, model development data technologies where we have an analytic tool workbench that can be used to build models. But as part of that, it's not just about building the model. It's all the ethical and explainable AI technology that comes with it. And I think, that's the other sort of aspect of this, right? Is to really empower people with tools, right? It's,
Yeah.
if you're an organization, you have 3 data scientists, and you're asking them to do all this themselves, it's going to be very,
Mm-hmm.
very difficult, and it doesn't exist in open source today. And so I think that's the other sort of aspect is making the full sort of life cycle of AI and machine learning model development and, monitoring and remediation all available. And that's the other thing that we're focused on is kind of recognizing that, some of these technologies need to be out and in the hands of data scientists more generally, and to put those standards out there in terms of, tools that they can use in their own development to continue along that journey around responsible AI.
Absolutely. And picking up on that point of communication, those who are listening, do be sure to connect with Scott on LinkedIn, because if you do have any questions, I'm sure he'd love to give you the chance to ask them, and I'm sure he'll answer them for you as well. Now, to wrap up this conversation, I'm going to finish on probably the hardest question I've asked you during this podcast, Scott. And given the crazy year we've had in 2020, I'm always a bit cautious about asking for predictions. But how do you see the lay of the land going for 2021? Is there anything that you think is going to be really poignant in the next year?
So it gets a little hard to predict, but I think, in the next year, I'd say we're going to continue to see the hype battle,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's funny, I've been in this, I've been working for FICO for more than 21 years now, and I've seen a lot of phases. And, I look back to like big data, and big data was
Yeah.
going to be saving the world, and you just have to accumulate all the data, and all the answers will magically appear, right? And there was a lot of pressure for people to collect all this data, and, in doing so, right, they figured out they couldn't solve these problems, right?
Mm-hmm.
But there was a lot of pressure. Today we're under other pressure, right? And that other pressure is, build faster, build cheaper, right? And this is really difficult. And one of the trends out there right now is auto ML. So,
Mm-hmm.
technologies that automatically build the machine learning model for you. And, in some sense, I look at it as, you put $200 into a cloud service provider and say, give me the best model that $200 will provide for me. And I think that's a tremendous risk, right? So I think in the coming year, we're going to see more of this responsible AI conversation, where, on one side, there'll be those that will sell the auto ML sort of technologies and say, no, they work fine, they work quick, they work cheap. And I think we're going to see the responsible AI front move forward, right, with respect to, the importance of the human being as part of this, right? The gravitas of the decisions that are being made, and I'm really hopeful in the next year that, we're going to understand that, no, too many very, very important decisions are made with these models, and they will continue to be made with these
Mm-hmm.
models. And not trust our future to, automated algorithms that people don't understand and don't have the right proper rigor
Mm-hmm.
around. It's interesting. there has been a concept that regulation inhibits innovation, right? And you can even look at some of the discussion here in the United States, and it's basically, well, keep in mind regulation, but don't let it hamper your innovation.
Yeah.
And I actually think, and I've been pretty vocal on this, that regulation actually creates innovation. There are ways to meet regulatory guidance and drive that forward from an innovation perspective. So I'd look for more of that, more reg tech technology moving forward, more awareness of these issues, whether mandated by regulation or whether it's just organizations understanding the responsibility they have to their consumer base that they serve, to have these ethical AI pieces in place. But I think that is what we're going to see in the next year, is that sort of battle of models for cheap versus model built well and responsibly. And I certainly know which side I'm on that front.
Absolutely. Well, I think that is all we have time for today, Scott. So thank you so much for joining us. I can already hear the applause from the listeners listening to this, and I hope you've enjoyed it.
It was a lot of fun. I really thank you for your time and the listeners, and really important topics, and always excited to respond to questions. So as mentioned, if you want to reach out through LinkedIn or Twitter, I'm more than happy to engage that way too.
Thank you so much. What a super session. I particularly loved the amount of car analogies within that conversation to really explain ethics and AI. And I loved the idea of it being important to acknowledge it on this journey of ethics. And it's not a case of do it once and you've done it forever. It's a case of revisiting it and approaching it in that journey-like way. Now, the conversation that we had here today is part of the Building AI-Driven Enterprise in a Disruptive Environment report. As I said in the beginning, this was conducted by Corinium on behalf of FICO. You're able to read the full report on our Business of Data platform. Do head over, download and dive in. What we spoke about today was really the tip of the iceberg, so there's lots more to get involved in. As always, join us again where we will have more conversations with fantastic data analytics leaders. For now, stay well, look after yourself, and I'll see you real soon.